How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
Today on Climate One, we look at social equity in Bay Area communities dealing with climate change.
When I talk to low-income residents that, for example, are transit dependent, if there's a flooding in their neighborhood, it is harder for them, one, to evacuate, and two, to get their children to school, to get to medical help, to get to their jobs.
Then we look past El Nino into California's water future.
What appears to be happening is that we're going to the extremes. We're going to have more droughts, and we're going to have at least as many floods before. And what is disappearing is what we might at one point have considered normal.
But first, we look at the relation between global warming and human health.
I think if you are able to reframe the argument or discussion to talk about not just the climate, but the personal impacts, people's health is personal.
Up next on Climate One. Linda Rudolph, what are the biggest threats? Climate change, people think about polar bears, glaciers, maybe sea level rise, don't often think about public or personal health. What should we be concerned about here in California?
Well, from my view, climate change really is all about us. And it's an existential threat because climate change threatens our air, our water, our food, our shelter, and our security. And the effects are myriad, ranging from the direct impacts like heat illness in a heat wave or injuries in a big flood or hurricane. And then there's all sorts of indirect effects like increasing air pollution from warming temperatures or many, many different impacts on our food supply, ranging from declines in crop yield, rising food prices, things like changes in where we find dengue fever or the spread of West Nile virus northward or lengthening of the allergy season.
We also have to be concerned about waterborne diseases in terms of a projected increase in cholera, as well as what we've already seen here in California manifest by algal blooms, which have here, we feel it at the level of impacting our crab season, but this is just one sign of the manifold things that we face.
Rachel Morello, crab affects people who can afford delicious crab. How about people who can't afford crab? What are the vulnerable populations in the state and how are they affected by climate change?
Well, the vulnerable populations are often people, for example, who work in occupations where they don't have control over their conditions of their workplace. So think about people who are in construction, farm workers who are working under very extremely harsh conditions under normal weather patterns. And then during the summer when you have these heat waves, more often than not, the people that are landing in the emergency rooms and who are dying on the job are people in those kinds of occupations. I think the other kind of indirect health impact, but I think one that's really one to keep in mind is sort of the economic dislocation that happens because of climate change. So for example, certain industries like the tourist industry, if we think about what happened to the ski season last year, which basically pretty much disappeared because there were no snow in the mountains, think about the people who work in those industries, mostly low-income people of color in the service industry, the hotel industry. Their jobs literally vaporize during those kinds of weather events. They're very vulnerable, kind of seasonal jobs. Same thing in the field of agriculture. When production levels go down, growers let go of workers, and so people's livelihoods are literally at stake. And then I think the last thing to really consider is that very often the prices of our basic necessities go up. And so for people like you and I, we complain about higher energy bills or higher food bills, we pay more for milk or eggs, but if you think about a low-income household that pays a very large proportion of their salary to buy food every month, that's a huge hit.
Bob Gould, there's been a lot of fires in California lately, and what impacts does that have both on local populations and people who are, where the smoke may drift?
Well, I mean, that adds to what we would expect from the same assessment in terms of worsening air conditions overall, in terms of generation of smog and ground level ozone, but in terms of the wildfires, they add an enormous amount of particulate matter as well. So we would expect significant deleterious effects on respiratory health and cardiovascular health due to those particles.
Katrina Peters, what we heard earlier about dislocation, stress, et cetera. It sounds like that there's, think about, I'd never thought about before, ski lift workers who suddenly don't have a job, or people who have to move because there's a fire, that sort of thing. How can you assess if someone comes in that the mental health impacts is connected to climate, or does it even matter?
Well, I do think it matters, because if you're going to come up with a solution, you need to understand the sources of the problem. I think many of us are aware that there are individuals, let's say, for an example, who were displaced from Hurricane Katrina. There are individuals who've been displaced because of fires. There's been individuals who have had to move because, for example, in some of the small towns in the Central Valley of California, their wells have dried up. So people are very distressed on these things, and they may tend to think sort of in a fatalistic way, I don't know why this happens, why am I so unlucky, why are things there? Where in fact, even though it may be a difficult situation, I think if there were a larger number of people who understood that many of the things that are happening are not just arbitrary, that these are things that are connected to the great climate changes that we see, and as we understand that, we're better able to come up with solutions both individually and in our communities.
I want to talk about the Central Valley. It's a part of the state where a lot of vulnerable communities are, et cetera. Rachel Morello, what is their impact there in terms of climate change? There's a lot of heat, a lot of local pollution. What are we seeing there?
The 4-year drought has taken its toll, particularly for people who are reliant on very small community water systems that only have, for example, one source of water, groundwater, or people who they're known as domestic well users. So their source of water is a well that's literally in their backyard, and those wells are drying up. And so they're literally having to get water from somewhere else. It's almost like people are living in a developing country where they have to go very long distances to get water for basic needs, and right here in California. So that's a very huge issue. And then the air pollution issue, the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley of California has some of the worst air pollution in the country, even worse than Southern California.
A lot of the Bay Area smog gets pushed into Fresno, right?
Yeah,
they breathe our exhaust.
And so with the increasing number and intensity, for example, of warm days and then also warm degree nights, we can see it's not uncommon to see increasing levels of ozone, which is formed from pollution from cars and industry, and it bakes in the sun and it forms ozone. It's not the good ozone that protects the planet, it's the bad ozone that's in our air, and that leads to those alerts that we all see about bad air days and when people are told to stay indoors and refrain from exercising. So those are the kinds of impacts that people in the Central Valley and the San Joaquin Valley are seeing, and highest asthma rates and all kinds of chronic health conditions that are definitely associated with air pollution that is accelerated by climate change.
Katrina Peters, another thing that happens on hot days is people get irritable and they get cranky. There was a 2010 study in Cleveland that showed a strong correlation between temperature and violent crime. The temperature went up, violent crime went up until about 80 degrees, when I guess it got so hot that people just became lethargic, and at that point it peaked. But do you see a correlation between heat and people kind of getting in fights, that sort of thing?
The early studies that are out there are showing that there is a correlation. I think we probably were seeing it before, but did not really necessarily put together the heat, the heat aspect of it. We also know even people who are on certain psychiatric medications can be adversely affected by being in very hot conditions. Also, when you're in the hot weather, people may not be drinking sufficient water, and then once you start to get dehydrated, even slightly, that tends to affect all of your body systems, including your mood. The other things that the weather can impact is people who have different illnesses. For an example, if you have asthma or you have COPD or other respiratory illnesses, you may find that you're having much more difficulty breathing, which also can make you more irritable and more difficult to function in your usual manner. So we're just beginning to really study all of the impacts of climate, and even though it maybe has gone up just a few degrees, we still have to find that these are having both individual effects on people and also community and group effects.
Bob Gould, what could an individual listening to this say, okay, all right, I live in the Bay Area, I think I eat well, fairly healthy lifestyle. What can an individual do to prepare and be part of solution to the health effects we've been talking about here?
I think what people need to understand is a real collective need to develop the political will to support the investments that we need to have a new economy and a new energy system that's going to be clean and is going to provide us solutions. And when I think of the fact that we're still squabbling over budgets that have been cut and how can we make the best solutions, there are things that we can do and we can support that, you know, I put on my PSR hat for it, but if we're thinking about spending $1 trillion for nuclear weapons over the next 30 years, or we're now facing a situation that was just reported the other day in the New York Times, we're spending $1.7 trillion this year for the international arms trade, which of course is facilitated by pumping more oil in the Middle East and places like that. I think we have to expand our horizons to think about what we should be talking about and really opening up the issue in a much broader way.
I just want to echo what Bob said is, you know, individuals need to think and get engaged in the process. And so, yeah, that means working with your community first. Start with your neighbors. Start figuring out how do you create a more resilient neighborhood so that when there is a heat wave, people know who the vulnerable neighbors are who might need to be checked up on. How do we scale up from that to building a more resilient neighborhood that has tree canopy and reducing heat islands? And then from that level, you start engaging with your city or your municipality or your community and saying, okay, how do we come up with a climate action plan where we're going to reduce our greenhouse gases and protect the most vulnerable? And then, so, you know, I think that you have to start kind of at a local level, and then where you're accountable to each other, and then you start to scale up and you start making the politicians accountable to the needs of vulnerable populations and the community as a whole.
You know, we have to first and foremost address reducing our carbon and climate pollution, because if we don't do that very quickly and very aggressively, we will make it harder and harder for ourselves to actually respond adequately to climate change. We're at a moment in time right now where we still have time to make a huge difference for our children and our grandchildren. So I think the single most important thing that everyone that's listening can do is talk to their neighbors and their city council people and their state legislators and their Congress people to say, this is a problem for us in our community and we want you to take action to really address it.
Climate change has not really been part of the national election discourse. Some politicians dismiss it. It gets mentioned occasionally. It's just, and a lot of pollsters would say Americans don't vote on the environment. They vote on pocketbook issues. They may be concerned about climate, but Katrina Peters, people don't vote on it.
I think if you are able to reframe the argument or discussion to talk about not just the climate, but the personal impacts. People's health is personal. So if you know that your family is going to be impacted, that your grandmother who used to be able to live in her apartment without air conditioning and has a number of different illnesses, that by going up a few more degrees, there being more pollen in the air, other things, that she's going to be going to the hospital more, and you're going to have to be the one to take off work to take her to the emergency room when your child has asthma attacks every day. And you're not sure how you can correct those things, then it becomes a very personal discussion. And once people understand that part of the solution is not just taking care of the individual illness by going to the doctor and taking medication, that there are other environmental things that they have to attend to, then I think people may be willing to vote for something different.
Yeah, I guess I think actually people are voting to address climate change. If you look at polling data, it indicates actually that a lot of demographic groups feel that the government needs to do more to address climate change. And you definitely see that among communities of color. They poll extremely high. And it's not just Democrats either.
Let's go to our audience questions. Welcome to Climate One.
Hi, I'm Robin Cooper. I'm a psychiatrist in San Francisco. I'm also an activist around climate change and work with Citizens Climate Lobby. And I want to thank you all for the contributions around your elevating the discussion about healthcare impacts. So I think that are very important things that we need to think about, particularly, Dr. Peters, in our field, where we understand something about human motivation. Maybe we need to think about what are the things that impair people's ability to make the connections, that shut down people's thoughts about that, and then impair their ability to translate their actions to the kinds of things that will push our systems.
Thank you. Katrina Peters, some people say that the human brain is perfectly unqualified to deal with this threat.
Once you understand what your motivations for things are, and most people's motivations, even if they are altruistic for the whole society, at some point it becomes very personal. And one of the ways that this conversation has become personal is when we started making the connection with healthcare. And many of the physicians may know some about the environmental things that are happening, but they haven't made the connection. I was one of them. I had no idea how many things I had been affected. I was in the fire and that happened in the Oakland Hills. There was the flood that was resulting from the hurricane. I myself was doing public health work in the Central Valley and developed asthma myself. Had no real connection about how all of these things that happened were actually very personal. I mean, you have certain communities. I work with a very indigent population, people who often don't have a voice. So if we're going to be able to protect them, they also either have to be aware, and also the physicians who take care of them have to be aware of what things may be impacting their care. But I really liked your thought about motivation, because I think if you can really understand the motivations, then you can come up with a solution on how to get us all to look in the mirror and accept this.
Let's go to our next audience question. Welcome to Climate One. We're talking about public health and climate change.
I want to raise the question about our political will, particularly as older Americans. I'm 70. And I think one of the things we have to do is make a greater effort to raise taxes to do some of the things we need. And we really need to push for a greater political will in our older generation to raise taxes that will reduce energy use and at the same time allow us to build the smarter infrastructure we need, which takes decades for our kids and our grandkids.
Thank
and
you.
I know it's not easy, so I'm just raising that question. How do we develop that political will?
The immediate thing that comes to my mind in this regard is the effort that we had in the Manhattan Project. I mean, sorry to get back to nuclear weapons, but we did have that extraordinary effort at the time during World War II. And I would say that we have the capability of summoning the resources to save our planet. A number of years ago, we at PSR, excuse me, were working with Daniel Ellsberg on a Manhattan project to dismantle the bomb, but I guess some combination of tax justice to provide those types of revenues to make these types of transformations. We have the ability to invest. It was a lost promise at the beginning of this administration to develop a strong blue-green alliance that would provide jobs on the basis of being able to really fund alternative energy. Again, I think there's lots of places we can get the resources, particularly from the military budget, and all that we're spending to destroy the planet.
Up next, Bay Area leaders prepare for climate impacts. Let's begin with Mayor Schaaf. Clean tech is not often on the top of mind when someone thinks of Oakland. What's happening in Oakland in terms of clean tech jobs, companies? What's going on there?
You know, we have more than 7,000 clean tech jobs in Oakland, and we're fast becoming one of the highest concentrations of solar-related companies and organizations of anywhere in America. And so it was great being in Paris to talk about how climate change actually can be an economic driver for a city and for a region. And I think that's something that California as a whole state is very proud of.
Actually more sun than San Francisco, so that kind of makes sense. Sam Liccardo, Silicon Valley kind of fell in love with clean tech and then fell out of love with clean tech after they realized that it's not so easy to make some money in that versus software. Where is the clean tech job creation as part of your economy down in San Jose?
Well, it's still growing strong, and we have great companies like SunPower make the most efficient solar panels in the world, and wonderful technology from Bloom and Tesla and an awful lot of other companies that are really going to transform and hopefully decarbonize our economy. But the reality is that we need both the innovation and we need the manufacturing, and that requires a bit of a challenge right now, given the price of land in a lot of parts of Silicon Valley and throughout the Bay Area, to be able to accommodate both. And so we're grappling with that a little bit, but we're starting to see manufacturing revive.
Because one of the raps against Silicon Valley is that they create cool things that are then made elsewhere, that most of the value and the jobs go somewhere else. So you're saying
and there are some and the greenhouse
made.
Gas emissions occasionally flow from shipping all those products from other countries. So we want to do everything we can to ensure that they get manufactured here at home. We're really seeing great opportunities increasingly to do that, particularly with high value products. Increasingly companies are recognizing the value of doing the manufacturing, where the engineering is happening, where the design is happening.
And Greg, if I could just throw in real quick, we're also looking at the social equity angle of the economic opportunities. And so we're working, for example, with an organization called Rising Sun, and they are training low-income people of color as well as our reentry population to go into neighborhoods, usually where they grew up, and help residents do energy audits of their own homes, as well as train people to do the installations of solar panels. So we're really looking for opportunities to leverage our climate action work with our social equity agenda.
Phil Ting, how about statewide? You obviously represent San Francisco, but sit in Sacramento. California is known as a clean energy leader. What are the priorities up in Sacramento in terms of pushing this forward?
Well, last year we had a banner year where we really doubled down on our climate change legislation. We renewed AB 32 to really reduce to increase the RPS standard from 1/3 to 50% by 2030. And then on top of that, we also went and set a goal for the built environment to make sure that 50% of the buildings in the state are now energy efficient. The one piece of the trifecta we weren't able to get done was how to figure out how to reduce our dependency on petroleum usage by 50%. I think the governor is going to be really pursuing avenues administratively. We'll be looking at different avenues. One of those ways is through our cap and trade funds. Cap and trade is a program where you're basically taxing pollution and using that money to incentivize greenhouse gas reduction. So one of those things that we're going to be doing is really putting more money into clean vehicles, and that's consumer vehicles, but also vehicles that deliver materials in the ports and all the high commercial vehicles too.
And the reason the governor didn't get that trifecta was moderate Democrats in the Central Valley and pushback from the oil industry. So the oil industry is not going to sort of let that happen. How do you think the governor's going to be able to do that over the opposition of industry?
Well, one, I think he's going to do part of it administratively, and I think others is we're going to have to look at other strategies. I think one thing people were opposed to was really taxing gas or actually reducing gas usage. There was this sort of rumor going around that we were going to have to ration gas like the 1970s, and I think that was not true. But what we can do is really move people away from gasoline. I know Tesla just announced their car is going to be a major change where now consumers could actually access that technology, with more and more people using that as well as natural gas vehicles or hydrogen fuel cells. We're going to really try to challenge consumers to move away from petroleum, and that will hopefully reduce our reliance on it.
Phil Ting, cap and trade, putting a price on carbon pollution in California. There's a few $1 billion that flows from that to reduce carbon pollution in the state. Where's it going? And tell us where that is. It's a couple $1 billion, growing pretty big now.
In terms of cap and trade dollars, we have about $1.2 billion of ongoing funds. Famously, one of our governor's major projects, which I'm a supporter of, is high-speed rail, and we're working very hard to make that a reality. I'm really excited about the potential electrification between San Francisco and San Jose, and now that the high-speed rail authority is really turned to focus on the northern part of the rail project rather than the southern part. I'm even more excited because, frankly, we all know in the Bay Area, we actually ride transit. I can't really speak for my colleagues from the South, but we know that in the Bay Area, right? We know in the Bay Area, we ride transit every single day, and we have so many folks who are really the lifeblood of that backbone of our economy is transit.
BART's about to come to San Jose. Do you think there's appetite for $4 or $5 more billion in bonds to fix up BART?
Yeah, there is. I mean, we have a huge pent-up need right now to address the traffic congestion we see all over our roads, and we know that transit is really the critical answer for so much of that. We also know regionally there are efforts, obviously, to shore up the capital needs of the entire BART system, and Libby and Mayor Ed Lee and I are all talking about how we might look toward 2018 for something bigger in a regional level across all 9 Bay Area counties, much as we're doing now with Measure AA, to really make even more significant investments in transit infrastructure. We have a lot of catching up to do. As the old Chinese proverb goes, certainly the best time to plant a tree was a generation ago, but the next best time is today.
Mayor Schaaf, it was about $400 million to get a little spur from the Coliseum Station to Oakland Airport. Pretty expensive. How are you going to convince voters that BART is money well spent when it's $1 billion to get to SO, $400 million to get to Oakland? It's big bucks.
Well, first of all, this BART bond measure really looks at fix it first and core capacity. The truth of the matter is, even though as mayor I could be driven places, BART is faster because traffic is so bad. And this is an overarching theme. Traffic congestion, climate change, affordable housing, jobs housing balance. These are problems that don't respect municipal boundaries. We have to act as a region and also see the interconnectivity of all these issues if we are going to put this region and our individual cities on the right track and really serve the people that we have living in our cities.
Our economy is regional now. It's no longer a San Jose, Oakland, San Francisco economy. It is a Bay Area economy where we all travel between all the different cities, all the different regions, and it's even more important at that time to make sure all the transit nodes are linked. And if we don't link them, then we're running this huge climate change problem because people will be commuting from Tracy, Modesto, Vacaville, and driving 3 hours to get to work.
They already are.
They are.
Yeah.
And the only way to get them out of their cars is to try to get them into transit.
And the Bay Area, I mean, you said this is a regional economy. I mean, it's really a global economy. The Bay Area's economy is equal with that of Sweden. So this project, fixing our transportation and housing and climate needs, is a good investment from the state of California, and I would argue from the federal government.
Mayor Schaaf, climate is often thought of as an elite concern, polar bears, glaciers. When you're in West Oakland, when you're talking to people who are trying to get by and pay their rent, how do you connect climate or fossil fuel to those people's concerns? You hear about it from your voters.
Climate gives us an opportunity to address equity issues. And so when I talk to low-income residents that, for example, are transit dependent, if there's a flooding in their neighborhood, it is harder for them, one, to evacuate, and two, to get their children to school, to get to medical help, to get to their jobs. When we look at people who live near the Port of Oakland, the asthma rate is shameful, shameful. And so when the Port of Oakland required ships that come into dock to stop just idling those dirty diesel engines and plug into some clean electrical source, that has a direct impact on the people in West Oakland who don't have to bring their children to the doctor so much, who don't have missed days of school and missed days of work, people who live near flooding hazards can have respiratory ailments from more mold and mildew. This is a human issue, and I love saying this, like, we talk about sea level rise with an image in our minds of a ruler sticking out of a body of water. And we've got to stop thinking about that. We've got to think about the family that is stranded in the flooded neighborhood, the family that is bringing their child to the hospital with an asthma attack because of the quality of air instead of bringing them to school. We have to put humans in the center of this.
Mayor Liccardo, that's a lot of what Pope Francis was saying in his encyclical, is think about the people, the equity issues, people hurt by the fossil fuel economy. How do you see that we can address climate and equity at the same time? Because often clean energy costs more.
It can. Obviously, it depends how we invest and how we plan, but I think Libby's fundamentally right here. This is both a question of social justice and of environmental justice. And, you know, it is so ubiquitous in cities like San Jose and really throughout the state. How close you live to a freeway has enormous impacts on your health, and we can predict what your income is based on your proximity to that freeway. We know that the mobility of people, the ability to get to jobs, to get to school, to get to services, is so much more constrained where you do not have cities with great transit options. You know, this dependence that we have on the automobile does not just take an environmental toll. It is clearly taking an economic toll. We are stranding entire communities with freeways that have cut through working class neighborhoods, really destroying those neighborhoods and isolating communities from opportunities in various ways.
I want to dispel a few myths, I think, by your question. So one is we actually have more jobs in this state in the clean energy sector than we do with the three IOUs combined. The IOUs are, I'm sorry, PG&E, Edison, and Sempra, so the San Diego Gas and Electric. So again, this has meant so much to our economy, not just in the Bay Area, but really all up and down the state, that the clean energy economy now has more employees than the three large utilities in this state. The other part that's really fabulous, especially in solar now at a price point is completely competitive with fossil fuel. The other piece of solar that really is wonderful is these are great entry-level jobs. These are jobs that don't leave California, because if you want to put solar panels on a roof in California, then that's a California job. That's a Bay Area job. That's an Oakland job, a San Jose job, a San Francisco job. And that's what we've really seen by investing in the state puts resources in, ratepayers put resources in. I know we as a city in San Francisco put resources in, and we're really reaping the benefits because our neighborhoods are reaping the benefits of the economy and the environment, but we're also seeing a huge uptick in jobs.
Because I want to come back to the vulnerable communities. Libby, Schaaf, people who are elderly or don't live in air-conditioned buildings. We're in a world where it's going to be hotter, more atmospheric rivers, where there's flooding events. What is Oakland doing for cooling centers or for other things to help people who are vulnerable in a hot and wild weather world?
We have so many resiliency challenges. Income inequality, housing insecurity, the threats of wildfires and earthquakes. These are all things that Oakland is no stranger to. And so as we look at ways to combat climate change, we are absolutely going to vulnerable communities first. We're excited to be part of something that I know Sam is also involved with, which is a design challenge that we're hoping to get support for, to get different teams that actually work with the communities and engage them and invite these very communities to actually tell us how they see solutions to these types of problems. And I think that kind of conversation and empowering of the impacted communities is something that we could do a much, much better job of.
We're going to invite your participation by going to the microphone over there with one-part question.
We're in the Bay Area, some of the wealthiest companies in the world. Mayor Schaaf, you're alluding to the Bay Area's relevance nationally. I mean, what is the type of interaction that should happen between private sector that has a lot of money and also has an interest in protecting the Bay Area, city level, state level, and maybe even the federal level? What is the relationship supposed to look like for an effective outcome?
Who'd like to tackle that one about cross-sector collaboration?
Well, I
Mayor
think,
Liccardo?
I know this is true for Mayor Schaaf as well, that, mayors of cities with a lot of innovative people and innovative companies are increasingly looking outside City Hall for solutions. And we're partnering with a lot of great companies around everything from designing less expensive ways to be able to move from old style of lighting to energy efficient LEDs, to being able to deploy sensor technology in ways that can substantially reduce congestion and greenhouse gas emissions. There are all these innovations out there, and we depend enormously on the brain power outside City Hall to enable us to move forward and really become models for other cities throughout the country.
So let's go to our question at Climate One.
When talking about climate change, a big focus is on transitioning to renewable energy, but transitioning from industrial agriculture to regenerative agriculture is just as important. Can you guys talk about your efforts, if any, in making the transition from industrial agriculture to regenerative agriculture? Thanks.
I can tell you that as part of our resiliency mindset in Oakland, we look at being localists in all things because it makes you a stronger community. And so kind of backyard agriculture, urban agriculture is a huge movement in Oakland. And it's not just about having food production being close to where it's consumed. It's also, a health issue, a food justice issue. I was just at Castlemont High School in East Oakland, and they have ripped out the asphalt and created a huge garden. They have a fruit orchard, and they now have a whole nutrition class. The most inspirational thing I saw was that they converted what used to be, this just blew my mind, a gun range for the ROTC, a gun range at a high school.
Oh.
It is the happy news, and this is particularly interesting on today's date, is that they are now teaching about hydroponic cultivation, and really they've now turned this whole area, what was a gun range, into a fab lab and a indoor agricultural training ground where the kids are growing their own food, they're making it available as healthy snacks for their own students during the day, and they're even working to go to corner stores and make locally grown fruit available at corner liquor stores in little baskets. It is a beautiful thing, and it goes beyond climate change as far as all the great benefits that this type of movement can take.
Still to come, California's continuing drought. Buzz Thompson, is the drought over? Paint the big picture for us statewide in California.
So the drought is clearly not over yet. We've had a reasonable year this year, but at best it's an average year for the state as a whole. Much better in Northern California than in Southern California, which has continued to experience a drought. And right before coming here today, I looked at NOAA's most recent predictions as to what is likely to happen over the course of the summer and the fall. And the best projections are that we are moving into a neutral period, sort of in between the El Nino and the La Nina effect, and that we will actually probably by the fall, there's about a 50% probability that we will see La Nina again. And so we are not even close to being out of the danger that we've seen over the past 4 years. And of course, the other problem is that the drought that we've seen so far was not just an ordinary drought. It was one of the worst droughts that we have seen, just in terms of the total deficit of precipitation. It is the worst drought in a millennium. Or in a century. And if you include the heat that was involved, then it could be the worst that we've seen in a millennium.
Ashley Bourne, you work with lots of different agricultural interests. How is this registering with the ag industry? Are they issuing a sigh of relief after a wet year, saying, okay, no?
No, definitely not. And again, it also varies across the state. So in the northern part of the valley, it's not nearly as severe as it is in the southern part of San Joaquin Valley, where there's a lot of farmers that still aren't getting allocations of water, or it varies even within the San Joaquin Valley, depending on where you are. And the coastal areas, again, in the southern part of the state are having, still having serious water shortages.
Well, I very much second what Ashley said, that it really depends on where you are, because it depends on your water rights, it depends on, things like that, so, and where you are in the water distribution system. So some growers are getting 100% of their allocation, and other growers, just heard 3 days ago, they're getting 5% of their allocation, which is not covering their needs. So, and then also I think, coming back to your larger question, I very much agree. We don't think that the drought is over, and whether it's the weather drought or regulatory caused reasons for drought, but just water supply is going to be changing for a variety of reasons for the future.
Hold on. Regulators can cause drought?
From our perspective, yes.
So they're not turning the tap wide enough, and they're holding it back to what, protect fish?
It can be for fish, it can be for temperature, it can be for salt. I mean, there's a whole variety of reasons for water not being available, or currently there's water that traditionally would have been pumped into storage for use during the summer, and because of fish, it can't be pumped. We all need the water, whether we eat the food. We all depend on the ecosystems, I think that antagonism, as it's been built up, is to me part of the problem, because it's been really hard to have good conversations about how do we go from where we are now to the future if we view it as, here are the environmental rights, here are the ag rights, here are the urban rights.
Well, I think it is a time-honored tradition in the water field to vilify everybody else. So if you're in Northern California, it's always the fault of those Southern Californians that are stealing our water. If you are an urban area generally, then it's frequently the fault of the farmers. If you are a farmer, it's the fault of those environmentalists who are taking all the water that should be going to the farms. One of the things that we have learned from this particular drought is actually the fish are not doing particularly well, despite our efforts for them. And part of that is that we do short them whenever we can. And what happens is that we sort of push things so far that they end up being put on the endangered or threatened species list. At that point, a variety of regulations click into place, which makes our life harder for people like Gabrielle, who need to be growing the food. And so one of the things I think we do need to do is to take a step back and think more comprehensively about how can we ensure that the environment is protected on a continual basis, and that we are doing everything we can to avoid having species listed.
Ashley Bourne, why does the environment matter? If you don't eat fish, why do fish matter? What's really being protected there?
Well, people do eat fish, so there's certainly that aspect of it, but they're also, I think, important indicator species for some of our rivers and streams and ecosystems and floodplains. And so if your fish aren't doing well, it's usually a sign that other parts of the ecosystem aren't doing well also. And in addition, there's lots of species that are dependent on those fish. So if you take that fish out of the system, you have a cascading effect on other species. So the fish are important in and of themselves and valuable species in and of themselves, and for all the recreation and food they provide, but it's also the interconnected web of species that are dependent on them as well.
I mean, part of the answer to the question about why are the fish important is because California's economy is heavily based on tourism, right, and our natural environment that we all enjoy, people who live here and people who come visit. And we lost 22 million trees over the past few years. We're not going to have the same natural environment unless we protect it, as well as, again, balancing our urban needs and our agricultural needs.
Max Gomberg, a year ago, Governor Brown stood in a brown field that usually was covered with snow, announced some historic water restrictions in California, 25%, about a year ago. How did we do?
We did very well. We hit almost 24%, 23.9 to be exact. And that really shows tremendous resilience by the people of California, because you're talking about over 38 million people all doing their part, whether it was taking a shorter shower, turning off the irrigation, whether it was businesses making changes to make their water use more efficient, from beer production to data centers in Silicon Valley. All of it really showed a tremendous response to this drought.
And do farmers get some credit for that achievement as well? You mentioned kind of showers, et cetera, but most of the water use in the state is in ag. Did farmers, do they share in that success?
They do. It's more complicated than it is in the urban sector for agriculture, because you've got surface water that's governed by a complex water rights system. Then you've got groundwater. We did pass a landmark groundwater law back in 2014, which is really going to help to manage the different basins, some of which have been severely overdrawn in this drought. So we're making progress. Some farmers have had to do more than others because of where they fit in the hierarchy.
The entire water system in the West was set up during an unusually historically wet period. There's more water on paper than there is in reality. Are we facing an inevitable sort of shrinkage or belt tightening here?
We're already seeing it. This is one of those areas where we look at what's happening with climate change. Our temperatures are getting warmer. Our snowpack is receding. The Colorado River is in long-term drought. That's water for 8 different states in the West, and the water doesn't even get to Mexico. That's a serious problem that's long-term and needs to be addressed, in part, as Buzz mentions, not just through finding more water from elsewhere, but really being more efficient and reducing some of our uses. That's true for the Sierra Nevadas as well. We're losing that snowpack. It's only going to be snow at higher elevations as temperatures warm. We're also, as some of Buzz's colleagues at Stanford just came out with a paper showing that the evidence is already in that we're going to more extremes. When we do have warm and dry periods, they're going to be even more warm and dry than they were in the past. So we're going to have longer and more severe droughts. These are really pressing challenges, plus we have population growth to deal with.
To me, it's about diversifying the water supply. So certainly for the Central Valley, part of the issue is that we've relied on surface water, which meant relying on snowpack storage and the gradual runoff dams, or groundwater. We don't really have much in between. And so the way I view it, and I think certainly from the Almond Board, something that we've been looking at where we've stepped back and said, okay, how do we fund research, we fund, that's part of what we grow our monies for, is where do we go from here? What are the issues? And so what we're looking at is, can we improve the irrigation? Just with what we currently know, can we bring new technology to bear on the irrigation to make it even more efficient than it currently is? But the bigger picture is really, how do we invest into, recycling, groundwater recharge, use of water? And so we have examples where we can see right now, efforts to take water from the cities that has not already been allocated and say, can we use that tertiary clean water and get it to where it can be used for irrigation? We have efforts where we're working with Sustainable Conservation and UC Davis to see if groundwater recharge is an option. Since most of the land is ag land, can that ag land be used? We know in certain situations it can. For almonds, we're not sure if the trees are going to be happy with it. There's basic agronomic questions that need to be answered in addition to the water side of it. Where are we on, using solar for some kind of desalinization, for things like that? So can we, again, it's not one big project, but can we find ways to diversify and figure out how to adapt to all these changes?
But it's also really thinking about the system in a much more integrated way. We tend to think about surface water, we think about groundwater as separate sources, and they're obviously very connected. How we operate our dams for both of those, there's a lot that could be gained from thinking through how to think about the system in a more integrated way, including land use and forest management and other things that could really help build more resiliency and stability in our water supply.
Let's talk about dams. They're a big part of the issue. Gabrielle Ludwig, do you think that we need more concrete, raise some dams, more storage to capture water and for times that it's needed?
Short answer is yes, which I know is a loaded question, but again, I consider that as part of this whole conversation about how do we deal with a changing way of water supply. So if we're getting more rainfall in the winter and less snowpack, is increasing dams, especially the ones that we have already, part of the conversation we need to have. I don't think that's the only solution.
So
definitely
raise Shasta Dam.
Could be an option. So I think we need to keep an open mind that is something we need to think about, especially given the changing landscape because of climate change, but I would not say that's the only solution.
Those Klamath dams are coming down, by the way, so that we see as a really positive step. And they're not the only ones that have come down. We had one in Carmel Valley that just came down. We have over 1,400 major dams in California. We've dammed every river at least once, except one, some multiple times. More dams overall is not the answer. We do need to be able to take, when we do have wet years and a lot of flow, we need to be able to store that water as much as possible. And we do have distributed reservoirs around the state to do that. We also need to get more of it in the ground, as Ashley was saying. I think that's really a key focus. But more dams is not going to solve our fundamental problems with water supply in the state.
Gabrielle Ludwig, we haven't talked too much about prices. Water prices have been going up in San Francisco because we rebuilt the tunnels to protect them from an earthquake. Do you see water prices increasing in the future, and what's that going to do to farmers?
Well, again, coming back to water for agriculture is very complex, and there's a lot of, depending on where you are, where the prices are. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. Fundamentally, yes, I think water prices are going to come up, and that ties into the previous conversation that whether you're talking dams or in general, we still need to invest in infrastructure. So for groundwater recharge, you need to invest in certain infrastructure just to make that possible. To manage these dams differently, you need to invest. So those are costs that someone's going to have to bear. So just for that reason.
I want to talk about another aspect of pricing, if I may, which is sort of pricing and human rights. We passed a law 4 years ago, the Human Right to Water Law in California. We have over 1.5 million people in this state, the 8th largest economy in the world, who don't have access to safe and affordable drinking water. We have a huge challenge there, and part of it is that systems are run with contaminants. There's not enough financing to operate the systems effectively. We have to come up with a way to pay for that. So the infrastructure we need is not just the infrastructure that Gabrielle is talking about, but we need infrastructure for safe and affordable drinking water for some of our most vulnerable populations.
Gabrielle Ludwig, when you talk to your members about climate, do they resonate with climate, or do they say, well, the weather's been changing my whole life, my dad did this, is that a concept that resonates with them, and the fact that things may be fundamentally changing in a way that their ancestors didn't experience?
I would say that in general, climate, at least the way it's generally talked about, does not resonate with most of agriculture because you're in a business where you're dependent on the weather. So for them, variability each year is already different. That's part of the nature of their business. So, but I would say that certainly the lack of a snowpack last year was a wake-up call. I definitely would see there's more conversations about how do we deal with this change, or, a lot of tree crops need a certain amount of chilling hours. If they don't get it, you don't get that much yield. So there's a number of things that are happening where I do think there are some questions starting to be raised.
Buzz Thompson, you have the Water in the West program at Stanford. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how, the broader sweep about how we're entering a new normal and how we've kind of just been lulled into this place of this wetness that we've had for the last 100 years or so, and how it's hard for the human mind to catch up with the new normal.
I actually think that the public is getting the concept of climate change, and largely because of what's happening in the water field. It is an impact of climate change that we are seeing today. And one of the great things about working in the water field is when you go to water conferences, everyone around you wants to talk about climate change. And that's been true for a decade now. Well, I actually think this is one of the sectors that's actually taking this problem seriously.
Let's go to our audience questions. Welcome to Climate One.
Gavin Newsom is elected governor in 2016, calls you up, Ashley, Gabrielle, Buzz, Max separately, calls you into his inner sanctum. I want to do for California water what I did for gay rights. I want to do the right thing. I don't care if somebody's ox gets gored. What do you tell him?
I've got a laundry list. But I think we really need to start with some serious equity issues that I alluded to earlier. We cannot call ourselves a leading state with Silicon Valley on the leading edge of things and have communities across the state where when there's a drought, the well goes dry, there's contaminated water, it's not acceptable.
Figuring out and investing in data and information, there's a lot we just don't know about our water use, where the sources, the levels of groundwater, how groundwater is flowing, weather, all sorts of things, and trying to figure out how to have a more transparent and data and information that we can all be operating off of that same set of information would be enormously helpful and a big move in the right direction.
What I would urge is that we have a public goods charge on water. That public goods charge should deal with the equity issue that Max talked about. It should deal with the data issue that Ashley identified. It also should help to promote new technologies in the water field. What appears to be happening is that we're going to the extremes. We're going to have more droughts, and we're going to have at least as many floods before, and what is disappearing is what we might at one point have considered normal.
Let's go to, yes, sir.
I was born and raised in Fresno, and one of the reasons I left Fresno was because of the chronically whiny farmers. And if you give farmers more water, they just plant more crops. So somebody has to break down that egocentric mentality.
But can I make an argument back?
Okay.
Do you eat? All of us are dependent on those farmers. All of us are free to not be farming because we have less than 2% of the population farming. So if you eat, and I don't care what you eat, you're dependent on a farmer.